Hello and welcome to the next episode. We are going to continue right where we left off with the last episode where we talked about taxes and incomes and so on. And now we want to actually understand what is a province, what is it doing, and how does it make money for us. So, as I already mentioned in the first episodes, basically, we do have development per province. The development just represents how much money or how much value is generated in this province, which is somewhat connected to your population, but it is highly connected to what your population is actually doing there. So for example, you could have a province which has 3,000 burghers in there, and they produce more value than, for example, 30,000 peasants which work in agriculture, because these burghers are doing a lot of trading on the global economy. So it's really dependent on what your population, for example, this screen here, what it is doing in this province. So you have peasants, residents, nomads, burghers, nobles, clergy, all of them somehow work a certain job and generate value for you in this province. But it depends on the province what they actually can do. We are taking Sana here as an example because it's a nice province with a very varied mix of stuff. It has urban infrastructure, which is called amenities. It has irrigations, which helps with the farmland. But it also, if we go to population, it has resident populations in these cities, which we have built infrastructure for. But it also has an inherent nomad population, which is the leftover basically. And it has some burghers, which are doing trade for our realm overall. Now what we can see here now is it has some trade power, which is coming from these burghers, which are doing a job there. The taxation is from what we tax in this province, as we already explained last episode. And we have an autonomy value, which has an impact on our taxation efficiency and how much power we can project in this province as a state. Now, each province, it has population, but it also has properties. There are actual properties which are worked, and there are potential properties. In this province, as we can see here, it has mines, farmlands, forestries, industrial, academic, and commercial. The district properties are not kept because they are basically urban properties. You can build as many houses, universities, and shops as you want. Well, I think your population will do this. But your actual mining, farmland, and forestries are actually kept on the shape of the province, like how big is it, what kind of terrain is there, how fertile is it, and what else is there. So for example, let's compare it to, let's take this one here. This one, for example, has no mines. It has farmlands, which is also maxed out. But its forestries, for example, are not maxed out. So there are some trees somewhere which are not exploited in any kind of way here. If you, for example, go down here into the newly colonized stuff like this one here, the rear Wafat, then we can see that there is some farmland left, but there's also a lot of forestries left. And this is from province to province differently. And how much of this property is actually exploited depends on your population, if it can work it. So you have a direct relation between the peasants and how much farmland, for example, can be worked. And most of the time, when you start up a new campaign, you will always have room to expand into. For example, this realm, after almost 250 years, the center part here in Arabia is almost maxed out everywhere, because we have grown populations and we have really invested into it. But we are not going to talk about investments, we are going to talk about wealth generation. Now, we have properties here now, and in these properties, there will be jobs. So basically, we have an industry tab here, which tells us what kind of industries are present in this province. These industries have a name, they have a throughput value, which basically represents how much population is working there of the potential population. And there's a skill value, which determines how educated your workforce is in this job, how skilled it is basically. The standard value is 100. If you go far above it, you will see benefits from this. Basically, the more skilled the worker is, the less labor is required to work this industry, basically. So higher education industry, which here has a skill value of 292, is a lot less labor intensive than in higher education at skill 100. So you need less people to do the same output of higher education at a higher skill level. Now, we do see here different kind of color-coded industries like crop, pasture, nomadism, coffee, marble, timber on the rural department, which is basically timber is made in the forestries, marble is a mining industry, and crop, pasture, nomadism, and coffee are all generated on farmland, which are worked by either peasantry or nomadism by the nomads itself. The urban jobs are, for example, houseware, textile, carpets, and processed materials, which generate urban goods which the population needs for consumption or for construction, and therefore these are only made in cities. And the elites, which are basically the clergy and the nobles and the burghers, they have their own jobs here as well with the education and the commerce. Now, and in these industries, you have population working, they have inputs, they have outputs, and then they generate a value or profit. And what we can see here on the next page is basically, okay, how much money is gained in the slot, how much is spent on input goods or labor costs, and how much profit are they making from this. So for example, as we can see here, that the crop industry and the marble industry are highly profitable because food is worth a lot in this region. And marble is one of the few goods which are used for construction in this case, which are also of high value. But for example, coffee isn't that highly priced currently. It's producing exotic materials which we can sell on the global market to, for example, European countries. And these are not super profitable currently because we are getting cheaper exotics from the Philippines, basically. Now we can also see details about the industries here in the next tab, which is also called industry. For example, we can see that the crop industry here is producing food. It requires fuel. It outputs a little bit of fuel and requires for this mostly rural labor force. And it requires farmland, of course, which it occupies, and when it's maxed out, it cannot create more farmland or rather a crop industry. And on the other hand, for example, if you take the marble industry, which is the third entry here, this one outputs raw materials for construction, luxury, as marble is a priced good. Inputs are, in this case, a timber, which is basically wood, or wood for construction in this case. And it requires rural labor, again, as an input. And of course, it occupies the mines as a property, which this province has a defined maximum value of. And all these industries, therefore, have defined values, what it needs, what it outputs, what it requires as a labor, and in the end, you get a profit or not a profit if it's not profitable in the end. So you can skip through all the industries here that you have. In this case, everything is profitable. That's why also our industry here produces a high profitability. And this is represented in our development in the end, because as we can see here, our rural population roughly produces as much value as our urban population. And as we can see here, we have 288,000 peasants, which are roughly the same value as 83,000 residents plus 1,000 burghers here, roughly. In value generation. This can, of course, change. For example, if we check this province out, Aden, our capital, we can see that the rural population here is marginal compared to our urban population value generation, because this province has a massive amount of commerce. All of our trade is basically centralized in this province here. And we can see also that our urban industries have a very low throughput, which means there's a lot of room to grow into. We don't have enough population to work everything we want to. And these jobs are, in the end, generating value for your population. And for example, in the case of crops, as a very simple example, crop is worked by the peasants. The peasants pay their fees to the nobility and or the state, which is your tax income to a certain degree, but they also have to pay taxes on, for example, consumption, if they, for example, buy certain products like timber or exotic goods, then these can be taxed as well, which are the excises. For example, there's a salt excise. If your population buys salt, then you can make a tax on that. And so these jobs provide value for your population. They need this to buy goods. And depending on what kind of taxation you run, these will provide you with tax income. In this case, as we already saw earlier, we have running noble dues, which is taxing the wealth of nobility. We have a land tax, which is basically everything that produces on property, which is not urban property, has to pay something. We have a high taxation on our peasant population. We have a low taxation on our burgher population, on their wealth actually. And we have a salt excise running, which means that we are taxing population if they buy salt. And that's generating 12.6 income. Most of that is actually coming from the trade slot, so all the things that our burghers do, but the others are also providing a little bit of income. We can actually see this if we go here into provincial administration, and there we get a list of what generates what kind of value. And we can see here that the revenue is 350 overall. And at the bottom, we can see that the tariff income is 168, which is basically half of it. It's just basically everything we can tax on trading. And then there's also a big chunk of property, which we own directly in this province here. And overall, so the excises basically on salt are not existing here in value. So we could actually think about getting rid of this taxation if we really want to. But on the other hand, we actually want to reform our taxation and therefore go up in incomes from these other kind of incomes here. But depending on what you play, like for example, if we look back to Hungary, for example, which is mostly rural at start, you will have things like gold mines here, which you can tax. So silver mines. You will have a lot of rural provinces where you can tax farmlands in the end, and therefore have a completely different setup of taxations and incomes as, for example, Yemen here. Now, it's worth noting that you should probably just scroll through everything in your provinces here and therefore learn about what is generating value in your empire here. And then as a last hint, because that will lead to the next episode, you have certain goods which are produced. We already mentioned food and exotics here, or salt, which will then be sold in these provinces, in your markets, on the global market to other nations. And depending on the price and the development of this price, your provinces will make a fortune, go bankrupt, get very poor, or whatever you end up with. But in this case, we get quite rich. So, and next episode, we are going to talk about exactly this screen, trade and resources, and how everything is connected on that part with the trade system.